Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Nick Talks. This episode's amazing guest is Danny Zlupko, and he's an ambassador for Manchester at the Together Declaration. And we'll get a little bit into that in a minute. First of all, welcome, Danny, to this show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, Nick. It's an absolute privilege to be on this show. Thank you.
No, you're more than welcome. Me and Danny are friends. We see each other probably every month because there's a free speech event in Manchester run by our friend called Rob. It's a free event one Sunday afternoon a month, and I'll put those details in the description. So if you live near Manchester and you want to meet other people who are champion free speech and want to talk about controversial issues, come along to Rob's event. It's free and he welcomes anybody to come along. I thought I'd give Rob a plug there. Could we start, Danny, with you telling us what is the Together Declaration? Just give us a brief overview.
Yeah, of course. And I do recommend Rob's meetings as well, Cancel and Cancel Culture. I'll just get that in there. They're absolutely brilliant. So the Together Declaration started as a protest and as a fight back against COVID restrictions and vaccine mandate restrictions. In January 2022, a petition was handed in. It was over 300,000 signatures to Downing Street. So that's how it started, and it's kind of grown into a more freedom fighting organisation. Sticking to the COVID and the vaccine mandates. And yeah, it's growing steadily, it's growing well. And I'm really impressed by the work the guys at the team do. Really, really impressed.
So what would you say are its aims and objectives now at the moment?
Aims and objectives, well, they're ongoing and changing, but they're all based around the core principles of Together, which is seven of, and all those principles are protecting our freedoms, Nick. It's all about freedom, whether it's be freedom of speech, bodily autonomy, the freedom to protest, everything based around freedom. That's what we're interested in. That's what we're fighting for, to make sure we keep our freedoms, because they are under threat. The reason I joined Together, which I'm sure we'll talk about more, it is my freedom was under threat. And I felt it.
Let's get into that then. So why did you join?
Good question, interesting question. There's the answer's in two parts, if I may. So there's the answer of why specifically I joined Together, but then there's the answer of, well, why was I looking to join a group like Together, an association like Together? So what happened during the very first lockdown, March 2020, I was at the time unemployed, my choice. Although I was starting to look for a job in March 2020, and then that kind of went out the window when COVID lockdowns came in. And so I had quite a lot of time to think. And I was never convinced of the necessity of lockdowns. Obviously, there was a lot of scare stories in the media, the way the media were acting, and I'm not think I'm justified, by the way. It didn't feel right to me fully. And I remember one of the turning points one day, where I used to live. I was walking home, really beautiful days. I don't know if you remember in that first lockdown, lots of really nice sunny days, and I think I was on my fourth illegal walk of the day or something. I think I've been out longer than an hour. And where I used to live, there's a park at the bottom of the street. And as I was walking through this park, I remember seeing they taped off parks so kids couldn't play, because if a child touched its eye and it had COVID and put it on the metal railing, and somebody else touched that metal railing, they'll get COVID, and everyone the world will get COVID on the back of the park. And I was looking at that, and at the same time, I could see my street. There was an Amazon van and a Royal Mail van, both delivering packages, parcels, and letters to houses. And I'm looking at the park thinking, not that I want to go on the slide myself, but a child can't go on that slide. But these guys can put things through people's doors. It didn't match up. It didn't seem right. It didn't seem fair that wasn't allowed, but that was. So I went home that night, that day, and I read the Coronavirus Act, and so I had a lot of time on my hands, and it just didn't feel right. The whole thing. So doctors could diagnose is the wrong word, isn't it? Certified deaths as having been due to COVID, without a test, which that obviously changed. But well, that's going to potentially unnaturally inflate the death total. So I'm not saying there was anything wrong or anything out of order. It's just more of a suspicion. It just didn't feel right. And then with the vaccine mandates coming in and things like do you remember when the freedom days were coming? But then it was, well, actually we need to vaccinate over 80s, and it was over 70s and over 60, kept coming down. I just felt my freedom was under threat. So I was looking. I made a decision there and then over that time, because I was 40 at the time. I thought, if in 10 years' time, when I hit 50, if the world has gone to some kind of weird dystopia, then if I look back at myself 10 years in the past, i.e., when I was 40 then, and thought to myself, you could have done something about it, but didn't, I couldn't live with myself. Yeah, trying and failing is better than not trying at all. Now, I'm not saying we're going to fail in our freedom fights, but so that spurred me on to do something. And I was wondering what to do. And then Together was in the news at the time, quite a bit. I was liking what they were doing. They were getting bits of media attention. And so I just thought, well, that sounds like a good place to start. So I joined Together. I joined some other groups as well. And that's actually how we met, because I joined Rob's Cancelling Cancel Culture group. So I was just determined to do my bit, not knowing where it would lead to. And I still don't know where it would lead to be honest with you. But that's why I wanted to join something like Together. Joining Together itself, as I say, it was more they were making some really good noises, and there was still quite a relatively new group when I joined. I think it was April or May 2022 when the memberships came out. I joined straight away. Possibly maybe a bit of a leap of faith, because it was such a new group, but I didn't mind taking a bit of a gamble if that's where it was seen as. It's been well worth it. It's been a great journey over the past few years. It really has. Yeah, I'm so proud to be a part of this organisation.
So that's why you joined. In the last year since you've been a member, what's been your highlight?
Good question. What's been my highlight? There's been a lot, but let's try and think of one. I think that the highlight has probably got to be, because everything probably stems from this. I've got to know the team. I'm quite involved in the organisation, so there's 6 core team members, and I've got to know them all, work with them, and it's how they work together and the inspiration and the ideas that they're all coming up with, on how we battle anything that kind of restricts our freedom or threatens to. And that's probably the highlight, because I said everything else stems from that. Everything that is the centre of it. These guys, these Alan, Leslie, um, Rob, Shad, I name them all, but just keep going. But that is probably the highlight, because that is central to everything. This core team of 6 people who run it, who do everything, and they're so passionate about it as well. And I say the ideas that come out of these guys are just bowling over.
Fantastic. So you mentioned before that the Together Declaration has some core principles. I think there's 7 of them. Could you mention 2 or 3 of them, and let's get into what that is? So pick the ones that are your favourites, that you're more passionate about.
Yeah, of course. Suppose the first one is actually no future overreach in the name of safety. We say never again to lockdowns. This was a huge policy failure, which must be acknowledged and never repeated. So I suppose that one has got to be, given the story of how I got involved with Together and lockdowns at the time. That's got to be a highlight, and one that I pick out, because I say I wasn't convinced at the time of lockdowns, the necessity of it, or of them, and think if you look back now, it was a mistake. As the principal says, I agree with that principle. It was a mistake. There was no need for it. The survival rate of COVID was over 90, or is over 99%. I think personally, maybe more questions could have been asked before lockdown. More investigation. It just seemed to be quite a snappy decision.
I agree. I think the first lockdown was announced. I'm the sort of person then, I'm probably changed now, but in March 2020, I was the sort of person who would go, right, let's support the government and let's give them a benefit of the doubt. So the first lockdown happened, but even for me, after 4, 5, 6 weeks, it was plainly obvious then that this was not the plague we thought it was going to be. And I think at that point, then I changed my mind and thought, right, this all needs to end now. And then we roll on 2, 3 years, It was only a couple of weeks ago. We've got people in Parliament and people who are running the country saying we need to start looking at another lockdown because COVID's coming back, a new mutant. It's like, have we not learned anything from 3 years ago? And the state of the finances of the country today are directly related to locking down and ruining businesses. Have we not learned anything? Or my understanding is if we're not careful, and this is what I think you guys are fighting for, if we're not careful, lockdown will be the go-to place for future governments, not just on COVID, on many things. We climate change, we need to lock down people in the houses so they're not emitting gases or driving the cars. Crime, we can't solve crime anymore. We need to lock down people in the houses so they're not victims of crime anymore. I'm a bit like you that I don't want this to be the go-to answer to problems we have in the country going forward.
Exactly. And I don't know if you remember, Nick, or you saw this. Neil Ferguson, who was on stage, remember he was getting caught breaking his own rules. Let's say fruity way, I think is probably a good way of describing it. He actually said in an interview, if Italy hadn't locked down, we couldn't have got away with it. Which now, yeah, I have sympathy sometimes with people when they use certain words because they might not mean specifically what they say, but those words are quite chilling in a way. If Italy didn't do it, we couldn't have got away with it. And that's one of my questions actually about the original decision to lock down in March 2020. Did anybody actually look at Italy? Because I remember there was lots of pictures from hospitals in Italy and people in beds, and they were quite disturbing pictures. But did anybody, without trying to sound callous over this, but did anybody look and ask the Italian doctors how old are all these people? Do they have underlying conditions? Is there any? Is it full of fit and healthy people who should not be ill from such a virus? And those questions, well, as far as I know, were never asked. Uh, which is surely a failure on someone's part somewhere. So yeah, but I do agree with you as well. The potential now we've done lockdowns into whatever scale. Are we in danger of? You say, well, reaction to this is lockdown. Climate, for example. People would argue the low traffic neighbourhoods and the 15-minute cities that are being imposed in certain places are climate lockdowns, which I can see why people say that because they are a reaction to climate crisis and achieving net zero. Um,
Yeah, I agree because instead of being locked up in your house, you're now being locked up in your immediate neighborhood. That's what a 15-minute city is. So it's still a lockdown. It's just slightly wider than it was when you were locked in your house. But as a free person living in a free society, in a free country, you should have the right to go anywhere you want in that country on public land. You don't. We shouldn't need the government to tell us when and where we can go.
exactly. And I don't know if you've ever seen Jordan Peterson's one of his interviews where he says, I think he's done a few where he says, authoritarians hate car ownership and human comedy. And car ownership is a great one because it does give a sense of freedom to people. I can just get in my car now and drive wherever I want. But the 15-minute cities and low traffic neighborhoods restrict that. I would have to pay a fine if I go outside my zone for over 100 times, for example. And then, unfortunately, in Manchester, not really doing 15-minute cities yet, we'll say,
You
just
will
in
be
case.
surprised because when I stood for Mayor of Greater Manchester against Andy Burnham a couple of years ago, a lot of the hustings, Andy Burnham, Labour Party, the Green candidate from the Green Party, and the Lib Dem candidate were constantly talking about 20-minute cities. They were calling them 20-minute neighbourhoods. And that was the first time I'd ever heard a phrase like that. And this was 2 years ago, and they were discussing then about how we need to get everything in our neighbourhood so we don't have to leave it, we can walk. And it's already being discussed.
Yes, it's being implemented on a consultant basis, like a kind of test basis in many places across the UK. To get together are involved in some of these. So Oxford is quite a hot spot. There's Bath, there's Canterbury, there's Edinburgh, there's the Wirral. Manchester is doing its bit in terms of. Don't know if you noticed that Deansgate's been they've dug up at the moment. There's little bits going on around the city centre without it being called a low traffic neighbourhood or a 15-minute city or anything like that. There's things just being put in place. I think
Manchester has its own project at the moment, which is called the Clean Air Zone. So that's being fought at the moment. So I don't think someone like Andy Burnham wants to take on an additional problem until he resolves the one he's already got, which is. So I talked about this again, running for mayor. I was telling people there's a congestion charge coming for Greater Manchester if you've got a business vehicle, a van. And I was warning people, and once this works, they're going to then start looking at cars, even though they say they're not. Well, they've just spent £500 million on cameras. Of course, they're going to start looking at cars. No one believed me until he became mayor. Then it was all announced that we're going to start taxing commercial vehicles, and the uproar has actually paused the project, and they're all running scared now. But these are the things that are happening. So can you imagine running a business? I'm not talking about the city centre. I'm talking about the whole of Greater Manchester. You're going to get fined and every time you use a commercial vehicle.
yes. And I think what's interesting about this, and I know you asked me a question about the principles. I will come to them. I've kind of taken us on a different direction here, haven't I? But if you excuse the driving fun, what's interesting? Do you remember the congestion charge, the official congestion charge vote? Was it 2008? I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, 78.8% of people said no to it, even though there was, just by pure coincidence, I'm sure, lots of roadworks put up at the time. I'm sure it wasn't to create more traffic. I'm sure that wasn't the point. But so Manchester has said a resounding no to any kind of charging for congestion or for whatever. So I'm sure that the people at the council, especially Andy Burnham, are savvy enough to realise that people don't actually want them. So it's interesting that we got asked about the congestion charge, but we weren't asked about the clean air zones, and we've not been asked about the stuff that's going on in the city centre, Deansgate being dug up and that kind of thing.
We're not being asked. We're not being asked because they know the answer and it's the wrong answer. Something else we was asked in about 2008 as well was, do we want a mayor of Greater Manchester? And the answer for that was no. And then 2 years later, 3 years later, we got one anyway. So they don't want. Same with Brexit. They don't want to ask the public questions anymore because we always give them the wrong answer.
Yes, we can't be trusted, can we?
No, we can't because we're stupid and we're racist and we're bigoted and we're just working class fools and we don't know what's good for us.
Yes, exactly, and that's it. And I do wonder if it's just a thought of mine that I wonder if the Manchester congestion charge vote has led a lot of other councils and local authorities to not ask the public, say in Oxford or say in Canterbury, Cambridge, wherever it is, because they know what the answer will be. In fact, Oxford has had a massive pushback. So the consultation in Oxford, there's thousands of people said we don't want this, and they've just been ignored. I don't know if you've seen the report about Sadiq Khan and the extension of the ULEZ. Basically, the accusation is, in summary, is hiding or ignoring lots of the comments that were against the expansion. So they're going to do it anyway.
I spent a decade working at Manchester Council. I've been involved in enough public consultations to know how they work. Councils have to go out to consultation, so they can claim they're still a democracy. But councils only go out to public consultation once they know they're implementing the scheme anyway. It's just a rubber stamp, and they will ignore the voices I don't want to hear. And there's always little. I mean, for the congestion charge in Manchester, the one that Andy Burnham's fighting at the moment, that went out to public consultation for the whole of Greater Manchester. And from what I can remember, so don't quote me on this, from what I can remember, they got several hundred replies. So several hundred replies to a project costing £500 million to cover the whole of Greater Manchester, a couple of hundred people who they probably handpicked, Labour Party members, were enough to get that project implemented. That's not democracy.
No, it's not. It's not democracy at all. Democracy would have been, let's make sure everyone knows about this, and let's hear what people have to say. Which would actually bring us on to quite nicely the seventh principle together. And my second choice, which is we, the public, must always be heard and not treated with contempt or sidelined. Our voices must be heard by those in power, which, are quite apt considering the conversation we've just had and what's going on with around the country at the moment with the low traffic neighbourhoods and 15-minute cities. My feeling is that the public generally is not being listened to. We're just being ignored most of the time. Certain members of the public are being listened to when it suits the agenda, but we're just not being listened to, and that is not democracy. One of Together's campaign slogans is "Take back democracy together." That's what we're aiming for, because it's just not happening. It's not happening at all.
I think that's been happening for decades and decades. It's getting worse. And I think the problem really is politicians have forgot that they're our servants. Somehow they've started to think they're our masters, but they're not. They work for us. They're our servants. They need to do as the public demands them to do. Now, how we work that out, how we get those voices of the public, can be done in many, many, many ways. Just because you speak to 8 people, they all agree, that's not necessarily representative of the public. That's just 8 people you spoke to. But how we do that can be complicated. But they forgot they're not our masters. They're our servants.
Exactly. I did a speech at the Together event in Manchester a couple of weeks ago, and what I mentioned was, I can't remember where I saw this, but it was do you know Bob Moran, the cartoonist? I think it was the Telegraph he used to be, and does some brilliant stuff. And it was that style of a cartoon, so it's not a Scooby Doo cartoon. It's a serious political kind of thing. And it was a politician stood next to a lectern on a plank of wood hanging over a cliff. And the only thing stopping the politician falling down the cliff was the members of the public stood on the plank of wood, providing a counterbalance. And it's a great picture because it shows the power of the people, which I don't think a lot of people do realise they do have the power to actually vote. And so actually, no, we don't like this. But a lot of people just get lost in, well, we're not being listened to, so what's the point? And I made the point, if there's one person stood on that plank of wood, then the politician doesn't have to listen. Double it to 2, doesn't have to listen. If there's thousands or millions of people there, the politician has to listen. They definitely have to listen. And it's not, ironically, there are millions and millions of people who do vote, and it's still not really being listened to. But then there's the possible problem of people aren't protesting enough. I don't necessarily mean taking to the streets and protesting, but protesting with the votes. So actually, no, we don't want this. We're putting this in place and we don't want it. Because one of the points at the moment is, especially with the low traffic neighbourhood things, if you pressure the local councillors to say, why are you doing this? We don't want it. And then look at the amount of votes that a councillor might win a seat by. It's not that many. It's only hundreds. So there is real scope for people, for independent candidates, to say, actually, I'm against X, Y, and Z, low traffic neighbourhood, whatever it is. If you vote for me, I will make sure they don't come in. And you only need a few hundred people in certain places to win that vote. So all is not lost from that democracy point of view.
No, definitely. Again, let's go back to when I stood against Andy Burnham for Mayor of Greater Manchester. The turnout for that election was something like 30%. So 70% of people didn't even come out to vote. And then he won like 60% of the 30%. And it's like, he could be easily beaten. But what I learned when I was going down campaigning was people would say to me, what's the point? I'm powerless. And the message we need to give those people is, you're not powerless. It may seem that way, but it only seems that way. You have more power than you imagine, because you have something that politicians want, and it's called a vote. And if you can get enough of you together, you can scare politicians into doing what you want them to do. Because what we need to remember is the vast majority of politicians only care about one thing, and that's being re-elected. And if you can show them and convince them that they will not be re-elected unless they do what you want them to do, as a community, as a village, as a city, believe me, I've worked with politicians for 10 years when I was in the council. They bend over backwards. That's all they want, is to be re-elected again. And because we've had it so good for so long, people have forgotten that. And they think the great life we've had for the last 70 years will continue. but it won't continue unless we fight for it, unless we get the right politicians. And if we don't have the right politicians in government, there's only one person to blame for that, and that's called us, because we're the ones who vote them in. No point complaining about politicians when we're voting them in, and we need people to stand up and start treating democracy with some respect, the respect it deserves if we want to live in a better place.
Exactly. And what's interesting, just related to that topic, before the event we did, we went out to around Manchester city centre on Piccadilly and Market Street, just interviewing people, getting their views. The event was about the cost of living crisis. We call it the cost of lockdown crisis. So we're asking people's views, and quite a few people said, I don't really know much about this." But when you started asking them questions, they would just completely open up, and it's like I don't think a lot of people realise the knowledge they've got and the power they've got. As you say, it's all connected. And there is that feeling of just leave it to everybody else, leave it to the experts, leave it to the politicians. Whereas actually, if people do just take a step back, a lot of people have got a lot of knowledge and do a lot more and be more active, and hold politicians to account more than we actually do.
Yeah, we definitely do. Part of the problem is we're a tribal creature, and we've been designed to want to follow a tribal leader, and that gets in the way of democracy. That we will just follow whoever we think is the most charismatic. Basically, that's how Tony Blair got in. That's how Boris Johnson got in. The most charismatic tribal leader. Let's follow them.
Yes, exactly. I'll go move on to the third. I'll finally answer the question now. The third principle that I'll choose is privacy and anonymity are a fundamental right and enormously important for citizens in daily life. The extension of digital IDs and CBDCs, which I'll explain what they are, create worrying surveillance possibilities by their very design. We must remain vigilant to ensure they are not abused. Now, this one stands out for me quite a bit because I am still interested in cryptocurrencies. Which will connect to a digital ID. So CBDC is a central bank digital currency. So instead of a Bank of England, you would have a digital Bank of England, which would issue a digital pound. You'd have one in America doing a digital dollar. And you can have your own stuff like Bitcoin if you really wanted to as well, but that would be probably outside the official CBDC. And what's interesting about digital currencies is you can program them, you put the smart contracts on them. And so, say, for example, I was your landlord and we're in the future here and we pay by digital currencies and you've not paid your rent for the month and you enter your house, my house, whichever you want to call it, by swiping a card, I can automatically set the smart contract to not let you in the house if you've not paid your rent on time. You can program your digital currency to say you've spent £30 on alcohol this week, you've been naughty, you can't spend any more. Or your carbon emissions have been too high this week, therefore we're freezing your payment. And you can make it expire as well. So your monthly salary, for example, could expire within a month. So you have to spend it or you lose it. Now, that sounds a bit dystopian and way in the future. I know that sounds scary. But it's just something you have to be aware of because I'm sure digital currency would be attached to a digital ID. So wherever you go, you can be traced. Your purchases, everything about you is on record somewhere. It can be used against you, it can be used for you, depending on which way you look at it. So that one sticks out for me as well. It's it could possibly be a very, very scary one.
If I'd have heard you say that 3 years ago, I'd have thought, oh, Danny, you're going off the cliff there. Talk about conspiracy theories. But the world's changed since then. I've changed since then. I've seen what governments can do. I never would have believed governments would have locked us up in our houses. I never would have believed the governments would have sent the police in to break up demonstrations on the streets of London fighting for our freedoms. I never would have believed the government would have allowed Black Lives Matter or the eco-terrorists to protest on the streets and treat them with kid gloves. I never would have believed any of that. So it's not that, like you said, this is based in the future, what could possibly happen. But the fact it's a possibility, we should not allow government, any government, to have that sort of power over the people, because once you give them that power, you never get it back off them. And we know our government today wouldn't do that, and the government tomorrow won't do that, and the government 20 years from now wouldn't abuse those powers. But 50, 60, 100 years from now, we don't know what governments we're going to have in the state of the country. We don't want to give them those powers. I wrote an article year and a half ago, on the social credit system in China. And that was eye-opening. That was almost, that actually was like a sci-fi novel I was writing. So for people that don't know, China has this integrated system at the moment. It's not fully perfect, it's not fully working everywhere, but this is the nucleus of what they can do. Their CCTV cameras have got facial recognition. They can pick you up walking down the street. That camera then has access to your NHS records, their version of that, your travel records, if you're late on paying your taxes, if you're trying to buy a train ticket or an airline ticket, if you owe the government taxes or you've got black marks against you, you're refused to buy tickets. You can't send your kid to a good private school if you've not paid your taxes or if you've been calling the government. It's the way it's all connected is absolutely scary. And this is China, but it's sneaking in here as well. And we need to be really careful that we don't set ourselves up for a horrendous future because we give powers away today that we think were harmless.
Exactly. And if it's any consolation to you, if you played this conversation we've had to me 3, 5 years ago, I'd be watching it, I'd be looking, thinking, what's happened to you? Me. No, well, firstly, my beard's gone grey. How's that happened? And secondly, what are you talking about? You're talking all sorts of conspiracy stories, theory stuff. I used to read conspiracy theories in my 20s. I used to love them. You're a bit younger, you're a bit naive, you get excited and don't really pay much attention to them. And there's things that you see people on Twitter jokingly say, conspiracy theories are just spoiler alerts, aren't they? And you kind of think, in some cases they actually are, which is it's a bit concerning. It's a bit concerning. But yeah, the digital, the China stuff, I'm aware of. Yeah, and we have to make sure it doesn't happen over here. And as you say, you rightly say that it's a possibility should just be enough to worry everybody that it might happen. Let's hope it doesn't. And well, hopefully, an organisation like Together would stop that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the point is we have to make sure it doesn't happen. I'm sure our governments aren't planning to do this at the moment, but again, 20, 30 years from now, we have no idea the state of the country, who's going to be in power, and we can't afford to give those powers away because we don't know who's going to be using them in the future. And there are powers. Even if we think the government's going to do something wonderful with those powers for us, do you know what? It's not the government's role to do wonderful things for us. The government's role is to create the infrastructure for us to be free and live free and do what we want to do within agreed laws that we all agree with. Don't murder, don't rape, no fraud, all those sort of things. We don't need governments to be manipulating us with the, what did they call it over COVID, the nudge theory. We don't need governments trying to change us. We need governments to leave us alone and allow us to live the life we want to live with no interference, unless we cross a line, which is the law, which we all roughly agree with.
Exactly. And I remember meeting a friend of mine last year, the year before, and I talked to him about certain things. He said, it sounds like your politics have really changed. I said, probably not. I just want to be left alone. I just want to be left alone as a free person, and that's not happening. And that's why I'm getting hooked. I'm not being left alone. I'm being told what to do and when I can do things and who I can see. Obviously, that's a bit different now, but this was not long after lockdown. So, yeah, it's being left alone. I think that's what most people in the UK, especially, just want to be. They just want to be left alone. Just leave me alone. Let me go and see my family. Let me go and work. Leave me alone. But it's not happening.
That's going to be the title of this video, Leave Me Alone.
Leave me alone. Yeah.
My final question, my final discussion point I want to talk about was there was a huge injustice done in 2020 to a group of people in this country. And there was a little bit of an uproar at the time, but they got thrown under the bus. And then since then, they've been forgotten about. And those people are the unvaccinated care workers, 100,000 of them, I believe, who lost their jobs because of this, because they wouldn't get vaccinated and were told if you don't get vaccinated, you're unemployable. And that's what happened to them. And no one seems to be talking about them apart from the Together Declaration. So well done for still fighting for these people. For people who don't know, let's get some background and let's talk about this group of people that we seem to have let down as a society.
Yeah, so I think 40,000 they were forced out. There's 150,000 vacancies in the care sector at the moment, and the care sector has basically just been ravaged by this. So, firstly, the unjust, as you say, completely unjust, forcing people out of their jobs because they did not have COVID vaccine. That's, for me, is disgusting. It's one of the principles as well, together against things like that. So those people were forced out, and I don't want to get too much into to the COVID vaccine itself, but you could still catch COVID, you could still pass it on. So what was the point of that mandate for those people? Those people lost their jobs, and let's I think when talking about stuff like this, or when reading about stuff like this, I think it's very important we try to humanize this. So I was on the call a while ago with Together, and there was some care workers on it, people who run care homes, and I said at the end, I said, what this has done, actually listening and speaking to these people, it's humanized in my head the issues. I knew of the issues, but I'm not affected by the care sector because I don't know anyone who's in care or anything like that. But I was aware of the issues. I didn't think they were right, but actually listening to these people humanized it a lot for me. And I think we need to do that and just think about those 40,000 people who were told you've not got a job anymore. So, put yourself in a position now, you're doing your job, and somebody says, actually, unless you do this, you've lost your job. Now think of that, you're losing your income, you've got a family to feed. The more I think about it, the more disgusting it gets, actually. It really is. So, yeah, Together have had a campaign, the original campaign against the vaccine mandates. More recently, we've been campaigning, apologise, reinstate and compensate those care workers who lost their jobs. And what was a little interesting point, when I was leafleting in city centre of Manchester a few weeks ago, and one of the sides of the flyers had this campaign on it, and quite a few people stopped more than usual, and they were a bit interested. Oh, what is this? What is this? And there was a care worker actually stopped, and she couldn't stay long, but she was absolutely livid because she was one of the ones who lost the job. But she was going to sign up. There's a letter on the Together website as well, which is togetherdeclaration.org. That's the background as well on the flag. You can sign up to the letter. So the plan is to get as many signatures as we can for this letter. It's going to be taken to either Downing Street or Steve Barclay. It's going to be handed in somewhere, an official kind of ceremony for want of a better word, and make it clear that we want something doing about this, and for all these people that have lost their jobs.
The the stench of injustice on this is so strong. They still haven't got their jobs. It's not even like, oh dear, that was a mistake, we're sorry, have your jobs back. And now what they're fighting for is compensation for the years lost. But we've not even got to that stage because they're still unemployable in the care sector. And we know all the evidence now. We know what vaccines do and what vaccines can't do, and the protections and what they don't. We know it all now, and they're still unemployable in the care sector. It's shocking.
Yeah, listening to stories on that call I mentioned before. There was people who ran care homes who just said the restrictions have just left all sorts of problems for them. And one thing that really struck me was there was a care worker on the call. She said, "Well, I loved my job. I absolutely loved my job." And I remember just thinking, I'm not really wanting to tear up, but I thought, don't get it close on this one, because she absolutely loved doing what she did. And to be thought about for that reason, for me, is, as you say, completely unjust, massively unjust. And that goes out to these people. And I think it's important as well that they humanise the issue. One thing that struck me about this campaign, I said, and it didn't affect me personally in any way, shape, or form, but I think it's still important we stick together on these issues, whether it affects you personally or not. Because if you're prepared to stick up for someone when it doesn't personally impact you, because you know it's unjust, they'll probably be there for you. And yeah, think about that. And if that inspires you to get involved with stuff, do it. If the unjust nature of it inspires you to get involved, do it. You know, whatever inspires you to get involved, do it. But let's all stick together. Whether an issue affects you personally or not, still stick together with each other. And for me, it's key, absolutely key.
I would go one step further and say it does affect you. It affects all of it. If we live in a community, we live in a society. Injustice that affects one group of people affects us all. We may not be able to work out how it does, but let's look at the care sector. One of the reasons why the NHS is in such a mess at the moment is because the underperformance of the care sector. So people have to stay in hospitals longer. So the NHS is crumbling on top of lots of issues, but that's one of the issues. So if you went to A&E today or you were suddenly ill and went to hospital, you're going to get slightly worse care now because of the sacking of those 40,000 care workers and how many tens of thousands of elderly people now are still in hospital when they should have been discharged. So everything is connected when you live in a society, a community. It affects us all.
Yeah, that's an absolutely amazing point. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great point.
Excellent. Well, cheers, Danny, for coming along to Nick Talks. I've really enjoyed talking to you about the Together Declaration. I'm going to put everything in the description. So I'm going to put the link for the petition for the care workers. I think that's the most important bit we've talked about today. That was the main reason why I want to talk to you, because that's absolutely shameful. But I'll put it all in there. And how people can join, how people can contact the declaration, the Together Declaration. But no, thank you for coming along, and I thoroughly enjoyed chatting to you.
Thanks for having me. It's an absolute honour to be on here. I've seen some of the names you've had on this podcast, and now I'm on it as well. I feel absolutely privileged. So thanks for taking the time. Thanks for being interested, and thanks for everything. I've really enjoyed it and appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem. I'll see you in a couple of weeks at the Cancelling Cancel Culture in Manchester.
Definitely look forward to it. Cheers.
Cheers. See you later. Bye bye.
See ya.